Welcome back to our channel, where love always finds a way through the storm. If you believe that destiny can knock on the wrong door to find the right heart, and if you love stories of justice, romance, and sweet revenge against those who try to bring us down, please smash that like button right now. It helps us so much, and if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that touches the soul. Get comfortable, because today's tale, The Duke's Accidental Bride, is going to take your breath away. The autumn rain did not merely fall upon the Yorkshire countryside, it besieged it. For 3 days the heavens had opened up in a relentless grey curtain that turned the rolling hills into a sodden, impenetrable landscape, and the narrow country roads into treacherous rivers of mud. From the solitary window of Rosewood Cottage, Arabella Hawthorne watched the deluge with a sense of resignation that had become her constant companion over the last 6 years. The cottage, a modest stone dwelling that had once served as the estate's dower house, sat on the very edge of the vast Hawthorne lands, a physical manifestation of her existence, close enough to see the life she had lost, yet completely separated from it. Through the fogged glass, the imposing silhouette of Hawthorne Manor was barely visible in the distance, a grand Georgian shadow looming on the hill. Somewhere within those opulent candle-lit rooms, the life of the estate continued without her. Arabella knew that at this very moment, her stepmother, Lady Prudence, was likely overseeing the final preparations for the arrival of the Italian Duke. The household would be in a frenzy of polishing silver and airing out the best linens, all to impress a man who was coming to inspect Arabella's half-sister Cordelia like a prize mare at a market. It was a bitter irony that Arabella stood in the drafty parlour of a cottage that smelled of damp wool and wood smoke, while the home of her childhood was prepared for a celebration she was forbidden to attend. 24 years of life had distilled down to this, a small allowance that had recently been curtailed to a pittance, a library of books salvaged from her father's study, and the company of Mrs. Beatrice Marsh, the loyal nursemaid who had chosen exile with Arabella rather than service under Lady Prudence. The silence of the cottage was usually absolute, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock or the turning of a page, but today the storm was a living thing, clawing at the roof tiles and rattling the window frames. It was weather that kept honest folk indoors and sent travellers seeking the nearest inn. Yet Arabella remained at the window, her hand pressed against the cold pane. There was a restlessness in her spirit that mirrored the tempest outside, a feeling that the suffocating monotony of her days was about to shatter. Her exile had been swift and brutal following her father's funeral. Lady Prudence, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her calculation, had wasted no time in securing the future for her own daughter. She had declared, Arabella too wild, too opinionated, and far too beautiful to remain under the same roof as Cordelia. The stepmother's logic was cold and undeniable. Arabella's presence would overshadow the younger girl, drawing the eyes of suitors away from the intended prize. And so the lie was spun, that Miss Hawthorne preferred a reclusive life of study and quiet contemplation, and the truth of her banishment was buried under social niceties. As the afternoon light began to fail, swallowed by the heavy storm clouds, a movement on the road caught Arabella's eye. It was nothing more than a dark shape at first, struggling against the driving sheets of rain, but as it drew nearer, it resolved into the form of a rider. The horse was a magnificent beast, black as coal, but it was fighting the mud, its head tossed back in exhaustion. The rider, hunched low against the wind in a heavy greatcoat, seemed to be scanning the tree line with desperation. It was madness to be out in such weather. The bridge across the river had likely washed out miles ago, and the main road to the manor was treacherous even in dry conditions. Arabella watched as the rider slowed, the horse stumbling near the gate of the cottage. Curiosity, dormant for so long, flared to life. No one ever came to Rosewood Cottage. The tradesmen left their deliveries at the gate, and the local gentry had long since learned that associating with the outcast daughter earned the ire of Lady Prudence. The rider dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the mire. He did not look like a local farmer or a lost merchant. Even through the obscuring rain, there was an air of command in the way he moved, a rigidity in his posture that spoke of military training or aristocratic breeding. He tethered the horse to the railing and pushed through the small garden gate, heading straight for her door. Arabella stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mrs. Marsh was in the scullery, oblivious to the arrival. Arabella smoothed the front of her simple grey woolen dress, a garment that had seen better years, and moved toward the entryway. Instinct told her she should ignore the knock, that opening the door would invite the world back into her carefully sealed sanctuary, but the desperation of the storm made refusal impossible. When the heavy wooden door swung open, the wind roared into the small hallway, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and ozone. The man standing on the threshold was soaked through, water streaming from the brim of his hat and cascading down the shoulders of his coat. He was tall, filling the frame of the doorway, and when he looked up, Arabella felt the breath catch in her throat. He was undeniably handsome, with sharp, angular features and eyes that were dark and intense, holding a mixture of exhaustion and relief. But it was not his appearance that froze her, it was the way he looked at her. There was no recognition of her reduced station, no sneer of judgment, no flicker of pity. He looked at her as a man looks at a woman who has suddenly become the only point of light in a dark world. He spoke, his voice deep and carrying a distinct melodic accent that marked him as a foreigner. He apologized for the intrusion, explaining that the storm had made the roads impassable and that his horse had gone lame. He believed he had arrived at the Hawthorne estate, though he confessed confusion at the modest size of the dwelling compared to the descriptions he had received. Arabella realized the mistake instantly. The dense woods and the blinding rain had obscured the main drive to the manor. He had taken the old service road, which dead-ended here at Rosewood Cottage. He assumed this was the destination. He assumed he was speaking to the lady of the house. He introduced himself as Mateo de Severini, Duke of San Ronaldo. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. This was him, the man who had travelled across a continent to barter for her sister's hand. He was the architect of the future being planned up on the hill, the wealthy saviour intended to elevate the Hawthorne name. He was supposed to be in the grand drawing room, sipping sherry with Lady Prudence, not dripping rainwater onto the flagstones of Arabella's humble exile. Duty dictated that she correct him immediately. She should direct him to the path through the woods, send him back into the storm to find the luxury that awaited him. She should explain that she was the forgotten daughter, the embarrassment, the nobody. But she didn't. Perhaps it was the cold, or the loneliness that had eaten away at her for 6 years, or perhaps it was the sheer novelty of being looked at with respect. Arabella stepped back and invited him in. As Mateo entered the small, warm parlour, he seemed to fill the space with a vitality that had been missing from Arabella's life. Mrs. Marsh appeared, her eyes widening in shock, but years of training took over. She took the Duke's wet coat and bustled away to prepare tea, leaving them alone. Mateo moved to the fireplace, shivering as the warmth began to seep back into his bones. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the walls lined with books. Shakespeare, Dante, Voltaire, volumes that Arabella had read and reread until she knew them by heart. He turned to her, and for the first time he smiled. It was not the polite, practiced smile of a courtier, but a genuine expression of surprise and delight. He commented on the collection, noting that it was rare to find such a library in the English countryside, and Even rarer to find a hostess who clearly cherished them. He began to speak of his journey, of the expectations placed upon him, and of his relief at finding sanctuary. He addressed her simply as Miss Hawthorne, a title that was technically hers, but felt stolen in this context. He spoke to her not as an inferior, nor as a commodity to be assessed, but as an equal. They sat as the storm raged outside, the thunder rattling the teacups on the tray. What began as polite conversation quickly deepened into something far more dangerous. Mateo was not the stiff, pompous aristocrat Arabella had imagined. He was sharp, witty, and possessed a deep, melancholic intelligence that matched her own. They discussed literature, debating the merits of the Italian poets versus the English romantics. He listened to her opinions with an intensity that was intoxicating, leaning forward in his chair, his dark eyes tracking her every expression. For Arabella, the sensation was dizzying. For 6 years she had been invisible. Now she was the center of this man's attention. She saw him glance at her hands, her face, her hair, with a growing admiration that had nothing to do with social contracts and everything to do with the woman sitting before him. But beneath the warmth of the fire and the thrill of the conversation, a cold current of dread began to flow. Mateo believed he was conversing with his intended bride. He believed that the intelligence and beauty he was admiring belonged to the woman he was contracted to marry. Every nod of agreement, every shared laugh, was a brick in a wall of deception that Arabella was inadvertently building. She knew she had to stop it. She had to tell him that the Miss Hawthorne he was destined for was a different woman entirely, a woman who had been molded by Lady Prudence to be demure, silent, and obedient, the very opposite of the person he was currently enchanted by. Yet, every time the truth rose to her lips, she swallowed it down. The temptation to exist just for one night was too strong. She wanted to know what it felt like to be admired. For her mind, she wanted to see how long she could hold the attention of a man like Mateo before the reality of her station shattered the illusion. Outside, the wind howled, severing them from the rest of the world. In the isolation of the cottage, the lines of propriety blurred. Mateo admitted that he had feared this marriage, fearing he would be shackled to a stranger with whom he had nothing in common. He confessed, his voice lowering to an intimate register, that he had prayed for a sign that he was making the right choice. He looked at Arabella then, and the weight of his gaze was almost physical. He told her that finding her here, amidst her books and her quiet strength, felt like that. A sign. Arabella's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. He was falling in love with a phantom, with a version of herself that she was not allowed to be. The storm showed no sign of breaking, and as the evening wore on, the inevitability of the morning loomed over them. When the sun rose, the roads would clear, the deception would be revealed. The magic of the cottage would be exposed as a fraud. But for now, the rain lashed against the glass, guarding their secret. Arabella poured him more tea, her hand trembling slightly, and asked him about his home in Italy, choosing to drown out the voice of her conscience with the sound of his voice. She did not know that by the time the fire burned down to embers, the course of her life would be irrevocably altered, not by the storm outside, but by the silence she chose to keep within. The man sitting across from her was no longer just a stranger. He was a catalyst, and the reaction had already begun. The violence of the storm vanished with the sunrise, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more ominous than the thunder had ever been. The Yorkshire countryside, washed clean by the deluge, glittered under a crystalline blue sky, the puddles reflecting the morning light like scattered coins. Inside Rosewood Cottage, the atmosphere was thick with a fragile, doomed sort of peace. Arabella Hawthorne woke before dawn, the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightening with every increment of brightening light. The darkness had been her accomplice, hiding the frayed edges of her poverty and the truth of her identity, but the morning sun was a ruthless interrogator that would leave nothing concealed. She found Mateo already awake, standing in the small, muddy patch of ground she called a garden. He had discarded his heavy greatcoat, standing in his shirt sleeves despite the chill, examining the few resilient roses that had survived the gale. In the harsh light of day, the Duke looked less like a mysterious spectre from the storm and more like a man of flesh and blood, imposing, vital and dangerously real. He turned at the sound of her approach, and the warmth in his eyes was immediate and terrifying. He greeted her with an easy familiarity, speaking of the roses and the freshness of the air, completely unaware that he was addressing a ghost, a woman erased from the very family he had come to join. They shared a simple breakfast prepared by Mrs. Marsh, who moved around the table with nervous, jerky movements, her eyes darting between the Duke and her mistress. The silence in the kitchen was not empty. It was filled with the Duke's growing admiration. He spoke of his relief, confessing that he had dreaded this journey, fearing the stiff formality of an arranged marriage to a stranger. He admitted that finding a woman of such intellect and spirit, someone who could debate philosophy while the world ended outside her window, felt like a stroke of impossible fortune. He believed the difficult part was over. He believed he had found his bride. Arabella sat across from him, the tea turning cold in her cup, paralyzed by the inevitability of the crash. Every word of praise he offered was a stone adding to the weight of her deception. She knew she had to speak, to shatter the illusion before the world did it for her, but the words turned to ash in her throat. She was trapped in the amber of his regard, unable to move. The destruction of the fantasy arrived not with a scream, but with the mundane sound of hooves splashing through the mud. Through the kitchen window, they saw a rider approaching, not a gentleman, but a servant in the livery of Hawthorne Manor. It was Tom Blackwood, a stable boy who had known Arabella since childhood. The sight of him was the swinging of the executioner's axe. Mateo stood up, assuming the messenger had been sent to guide them to the main road, his expression open and unconcerned. Mrs. Marsh dropped a spoon, the clatter loud in the sudden stillness. When the door opened, the cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth. Tom stood on the threshold, cap in hand, breathless and wide-eyed. He spotted the Duke immediately, relief washing over his young face. He babbled an apology, explaining that the household at the manor had been in a state of panic, fearing the Duke had been swept away by the river or lost in the woods. Lady Prudence, he reported, was beside herself with worry, and Miss Cordelia had been dressed and waiting in the drawing-room since first light. The Duke's brow furrowed in confusion. He turned to Arabella, a small, puzzled smile playing on his lips, waiting for her to explain the servant's strange rambling. He asked why the household was waiting when Miss Hawthorne was standing right here. Tom Blackwood, innocent of the devastation he was about to cause, looked from the Duke to Arabella and back again. With a clumsy, respectful nod, he clarified the situation with brutal simplicity. He addressed Arabella by her name, expressing surprise to find her there, and then, turning to the Duke, he explained that this was Miss Arabella, the elder sister who lived in the dower house. The intended bride, Miss Cordelia, was at the manor on the hill. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Mateo did not move. The smile didn't fall from his face so much as it froze and then slowly disintegrated, replaced by a dawn of comprehension that was painful to witness. He looked at Arabella, really looked at her, seeing for the first time the worn fabric of her dress, the poverty of the cottage and the desperation in her eyes. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Her hesitation, her vague answers about the family, the isolation. He asked, his voice quiet and dangerously level, if it was true. Arabella could not lie. She stood, her hands gripping the back of her chair for support, and nodded. She watched. The warmth in his eyes extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard shock. He accused her then, not with shouting, but with a precise recitation of the facts. She had let him believe she was his betrothed. She had accepted his confidences, his admiration, and his trust, all while knowing he was pledged to another woman, her own sister. Arabella offered no defense for the act itself, only for the motive. She spoke of her exile, of the 6 years of invisibility, of the hunger to be treated, just for one night, as a person of value rather than a shameful secret. She told him that his arrival had been the first time in years she had felt alive, and she had been too weak to extinguish that light. The Duke listened, his face a mask of stone. He was a man of honor, a man who valued truth above all else, and the betrayal cut deep. He did not yell. He simply withdrew. He donned his greatcoat with methodical precision, the movements sharp and final. He thanked Mrs. Marsh for her hospitality, his tone impeccably polite and utterly distant, and then turned to Arabella one last time. He told her that he understood loneliness, but he did not understand deception. With that, he walked out of the cottage, mounted his horse, and followed the stable boy toward the manor, leaving Arabella standing in the wreckage of her own making. The ride to Hawthorne Manor was short, but for Mateo it was a journey between two worlds. He left behind the warm, intellectual intimacy of the cottage and ascended toward the cold, imposing grandeur of the estate on the hill. The manor was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, projecting wealth and power. But as he crossed the threshold, the contrast was visceral. The air here was not filled with the scent of old books and wood smoke, but with beeswax and stiff floral arrangements. Lady Prudence was waiting. She swept into the entrance hall, a vision of calculated elegance, her relief at his safety instantly morphing into a performance of charming hostess. She dismissed his apologies for the delay, her eyes scanning him for any sign of dissatisfaction, her voice pitching high with forced gaiety. She made a disparaging comment about the confusion of the cottage, brushing aside Arabella's existence as one would a speck of dust on a fine coat. She labelled her stepdaughter difficult and reclusive, painting a picture of a woman who chose isolation due to a defect of character. Then she introduced Cordelia. Mateo was led into the drawing-room, where his intended bride waited. Cordelia Hawthorne was the picture of perfection. She was fair, delicate, and dressed in the height of fashion, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to perfect. She curtsied with flawless grace, her eyes cast down in demure modesty. She was exactly what the contract had promised. She was exactly what a duke was supposed to want, and she was entirely empty. As the morning wore on, Mateo engaged her in conversation, or attempted to. He asked about her interests, her thoughts on the countryside, her reading habits. To every question Cordelia offered a polite, rehearsed answer that contained no substance. She looked constantly to her mother for approval, terrified of stepping out of line. There was no spark, no challenge, no hidden depth. She was a beautiful vessel, hollowed out by her mother's ambition. The comparison was agonizing. Every time Cordelia offered a bland platitude, Mateo heard Arabella's passionate defense of Dante. Every time Cordelia agreed with him simply to be agreeable, he remembered Arabella's fiery debate about philosophy. He looked at the luxury surrounding him, the silk wallpapers, the silver tea service, the perfectly manicured gardens, and felt a suffocating sense of entrapment. He realized that the mistake of the previous night had not been the storm. The mistake was this arrangement. Lady Prudence chattered on, outlining the wedding plans, the social calendar, the future she had mapped out for him. She spoke of merging their families, of the prestige, of the perfect match she had orchestrated. She was smug, triumphant, believing the game was won. She did not see the darkening storm in the Duke's eyes. She did not realize that by banishing Arabella, she had not hidden the flaw in her plan, but rather highlighted the only thing of value on the estate. The breaking point came when Prudence made a casual, cruel joke about Arabella's spinsterhood, implying that her stepdaughter was unworthy of any man's attention. Mateo set his teacup down. The clink of china against the saucer sounded like a gavel strike. He stood up, his height dominating the room. The polite veneer he had worn since arriving at the manor cracked and fell away. He interrupted Lady Prudence mid-sentence, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. He addressed the matriarch directly, stating that there had been a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the nature of the contract. He admitted that he had come to England seeking a partnership, a union of minds as well as estates. He looked at Cordelia, not with unkindness, but with a finality that made the girl pale. He apologized to her, acknowledging her beauty and her grace, but stating clearly that they were strangers who would never be anything more. Then he dropped the blade. He announced that he would not be marrying Miss Cordelia. He declared that his time in the storm had revealed the true heart of the Hawthorne family, and it did not reside in the manor. He told Lady Prudence that he intended to return to Rosewood Cottage. He intended to court the woman who had lied to him, because even her deception contained more truth and passion than all the polished honesty of the manor. Lady Prudence sat frozen, her mouth slightly agape, the colour draining from her face as the magnitude of the insult hit her. Cordelia let out a small gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. But Mateo did not wait for their reaction. He turned on his heel and walked out of the drawing room, out of the manor and back toward the stables. He rode back down the hill, the image of Arabella's tear-stained face burning in his mind. He was furious with her, yes. The betrayal still stung, but the thought of leaving her to wither in that cottage while he married a shadow was intolerable. He was returning to a woman who had deceived him, armed with the knowledge that she was the only one worth fighting for, and unaware that his decision had just ignited a war that would threaten to consume them both. The storm had passed, but the true tempest was only just beginning. The rejection of Cordelia Hawthorne by the Duke of San Ronaldo did not result in a quiet annulment of expectations. It triggered a scorched earth campaign that shook the very foundations of Yorkshire society. When Mateo rode back down the hill to Rosewood Cottage, he did not merely return to a woman, he crossed a battle line. His arrival at the cottage was met not with the storm-tossed desperation of their first meeting, but with a grim determination. He found Arabella waiting in the garden, the knowledge of his departure still heavy in the air. The reconciliation that followed was not spoken in flowery declarations, but enacted through decisive presence. He stood beside her, making it clear to the watching world, represented by the twitching curtains of the village, that his allegiance had shifted irrevocably. However, Lady Prudence was a woman for whom humiliation was a fuel more potent than coal. Within hours of the Duke's departure from the manor, her retribution began, swift, silent, and devastating. She did not scream or weep. Instead, she sat at her writing desk and systematically dismantled her stepdaughter's fragile existence. The first blow landed the following morning. A courier arrived at Rosewood Cottage, not with a letter of reconciliation, but with a legal notice. It stated in dry bureaucratic language that the meagre allowance Arabella had subsisted on for 6 years was immediately and permanently revoked. The funds, which had barely covered coal and flour, were cut off at the source. But Prudence's malice extended beyond mere finances. By noon, word had been sent to every merchant, butcher and baker in the village. The message was implicit but clear. Anyone who extended credit or sold goods to the outcast at the dower house would lose the lucrative patronage of Hawthorne Manor forever. Arabella found herself under siege. When Mrs. Marsh walked to the village market, basket in hand, she was met with turned backs and closed doors. The baker, a man who had known Arabella since she was a child, stared at the floor and muttered that he had nothing to sell. The coal merchant claimed his stocks were depleted. The cottage, already drafty and damp, began to cool rapidly as the fuel reserves dwindled. Lady Prudence intended to starve the rebellion out, quite literally. She calculated that hunger and cold would force Arabella to flee, or better yet, come, crawling back to beg for mercy, proving to the Duke that his chosen bride was nothing more than a beggar. Mateo, however, was not a man to be outmaneuvered by village politics. When he discovered the empty larder and the unlit hearth, his reaction was volcanic. He did not attempt to negotiate with the terrified villagers. Instead, he utilized the vast resources of the San Ronaldo fortune. He dispatched his own servants to a neighboring town, bypassing the local boycott entirely, and returned with wagons laden with supplies. But he recognized that Rosewood Cottage was no longer a home. It was a target. In a move that scandalized the county even further, the Duke leased Hartley House, a substantial estate several miles away that had sat empty for years. He did not ask for permission, he simply acted. He organized the transfer of Arabella and Mrs. Marsh to the new residence within a day. To the watching eyes of society, this was the final confirmation of their worst suspicions. A duke setting up a young unmarried woman in a private estate could only mean one thing. The narrative shifted from a broken engagement to a sordid affair. Arabella was no longer just a poor relation. She was now painted as a kept woman, a mistress ensnared by foreign wealth. The move to Hartley House provided physical comfort, warmth, food and safety, but it deepened Arabella's social isolation. The high walls of the estate protected her from the wind, but not from the whispers. Invitations to local gatherings ceased completely. When she ventured out in the carriage Mateo had provided, occupants of passing vehicles would pointedly look away. She was living in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury, but stripped of her reputation. Mateo visited daily, his courtship proper and supervised scrupulously by Mrs. Marsh and his own housekeeper, but the world saw only what it wanted to see, a scandalous arrangement born of deception. It was in this atmosphere of suffocating judgment that a hooded figure arrived at the service entrance of Hartley House one rainy afternoon. The visitor moved with a furtiveness that suggested fear of discovery. When the cloak was lowered in the privacy of the library, Arabella found herself face to face with Cordelia. The reunion was fraught with tension. Arabella expected anger, accusations, or a delivery of another venomous message from their stepmother. Instead, she witnessed the crumbling of the perfect porcelain doll. Cordelia, usually so composed, dissolved into tears. She revealed a truth that had been buried under years of obedience. She had never wanted the Duke. She confessed that the prospect of marrying a stranger and moving to Italy had terrified her. She spoke of her secret passion for painting, a pursuit Lady Prudence had forbidden as common, and her desire for a quiet life in the English countryside. Cordelia explained that Mateo's rejection had not broken her heart. It had liberated her. For the first time, she saw a crack in her mother's absolute control. She had risked her own standing to come to Hartley House, driven by a desperate need to reconnect with the sister she had been forced to abandon. They spoke for hours, dismantling the walls of silence that had separated them. Cordelia's visit changed the dynamic of the conflict. Arabella realized she was not fighting against her sister, but for her, and that the enemy was solely the toxicity of Lady Prudence's ambition. However, just as this fragile personal victory was secured, the war escalated to a national stage. Lady Prudence, realizing that local starvation tactics had failed, utilized her connections in London. She aimed not just at Arabella, but at the Duke himself. A week later, a copy of a prominent London society gazette arrived at Hartley House. The headline was a masterpiece of slanderous innuendo, foreign nobility and the degradation of English morals, a tale of deception in Yorkshire. The article did not name names directly, but the identities were unmistakable. It wove a lurid tale of a naive foreign duke, ensnared by the wiles of a fallen woman, a spinster who had used artifice and impersonation to trick him into an illicit association. It questioned the duke's judgment, his honor, and even the validity of his title, implying that no true gentleman would be so easily duped or would abandon a virtuous flower, Cordelia, for a weed of questionable character. The damage was catastrophic. This was no longer idle village gossip. It was a printed attack on the house of San Ronaldo. It threatened Mateo's business interests in London and cast a shadow over his standing in the British aristocracy. The implication was clear. If he persisted in this course, he would be socially destroyed. Lady Prudence had fired a cannon shot that demanded a response. She was betting that the Duke would value his reputation over his heart, forcing him to abandon Arabella to save his own name. Mateo read the article in the library of Hartley House, his expression darkening with a terrifying calm. He did not crumple the paper. He folded it with precise, lethal movements. He looked at Arabella, who sat pale and trembling, the weight of the guilt crushing her. She saw the calculation in his eyes and feared the end. She braced herself for him to say that the cost was too high, that he could not war with the entire British press. Instead, the Duke stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-swept grounds. He spoke not of retreat, but of escalation. He realized that hiding at Hartley House, playing by the rules of a polite society that had already condemned them, was a losing strategy. The article was meant to shame them into silence. Therefore, the only counter-move was to be louder, bolder, and more undeniable than the lies. He turned to Arabella, his decision made. He announced that they would not cower. He declared that they would attend the upcoming winter ball hosted by Lord Hartley. It was the premier event of the season, a gathering of the most influential peers in the county. It would be a viper's nest of gossip and judgment, the very place Lady Prudence would expect them to avoid. By walking into the lion's den, Mateo intended to force society to look them in the eye. It was a gamble of immense proportions. One misstep, one moment of weakness, and they would be torn apart by the wolves in silk and satin. But as the thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing the storm that had brought them together, the Duke began to outline a plan that would turn their defense into a spectacular offense. The siege was over. The counterattack was about to begin. The strategy to reclaim Arabella Hawthorne's reputation was not formed in a drawing room, but in the tactical mind of the Duke of San Ronaldo. He understood that the slanderous article published in London had shifted the battlefield from private whispers to public honor. To retreat now, or to issue a quiet legal denial, would be interpreted as an admission of guilt. The only way to silence a loud lie was with a louder truth, and the stage for this revelation was to be Lord Edmund Hartley's winter ball. Lord Hartley, a man of 75 with a reputation as formidable as the granite of the Yorkshire moors, became the linchpin of this counter-offensive. He had been a close friend of Arabella's late father, and for years he had watched with quiet disapproval as Lady Prudence dismantled the Hawthorne family. The slanderous article had finally exhausted his patience. He did not merely send an invitation to the Duke and Arabella, he extended his personal protection. He visited Hartley House privately, his carriage seen by all the spies in the village, and pledged that his ballroom would be a sanctuary. His endorsement was a signal to the county. An attack on Arabella was now an attack on Lord Hartley himself. The preparations for the evening took on the solemnity of armouring for war. Mateo insisted that Arabella's appearance leave no room for pity or derision. He commissioned a gown from a seamstress brought up from London, bypassing the local boycotts entirely. The dress was a statement of defiance woven in silk, a creation of pale ivory, overlaid with intricate gold lace, regal and commanding. It was not the attire of a penitent sinner seeking forgiveness. It was the raiment of a future duchess. As Arabella stood before the mirror on the night of the ball, the transformation was absolute. The frightened, grey-clad girl of the cottage had vanished. In her place stood a woman who looked capable of weathering a hurricane. The journey to Lord Hartley's estate was made in a silence thick with anticipation. The carriage rattled over the frozen roads, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. Arabella gripped her fan until her knuckles turned white, aware that they were driving toward a precipice. The manor, when it came into view, was ablaze with light, hundreds of candles flickering in the windows, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted lawns. Carriages lined the drive, disgorging the elite of Yorkshire society, the very people who had shunned Arabella for 6 years, now gathered to witness her destruction. Their arrival was timed with precision. They waited until the ball was in full swing, ensuring that the room would be at its most crowded. When the footman opened the carriage door, the biting cold of the winter night rushed in, a stark contrast to the heat that awaited them inside. Mateo offered his arm, his grip firm and reassuring. He did not speak, but his demeanor communicated an absolute, unshakable confidence. They ascended the grand staircase, the murmur of the crowd growing louder with every step. At the top, the majordomo struck his staff against the floor. The sound cracked through the air like a pistol shot. "The Duke of San Ronaldo," the announcer boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "and Miss Arabella Hawthorne." The effect was instantaneous. The orchestra, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, faltered and fell. Silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Hundreds of heads turned toward the entrance. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the rustle of silk and the crackle of the fire. The cut direct, the social weapon of ignoring an unwanted guest, hung heavy in the air. Lady Prudence had done her work well. The crowd stared with a mixture of hostility and morbid curiosity, waiting for the ground to open up and swallow the interlopers. But the ground held. Arabella, bolstered by the steel in Mateo's arm, lifted her chin. They did not wait for approval. They stepped onto the floor. Lord Hartley broke the paralysis. The elderly peer marched across the ballroom, his cane thumping, rhythmically parting the sea of guests like a ship cutting through ice. He did not offer a polite nod. He bowed low over Arabella's hand, a gesture of respect usually reserved for royalty. He welcomed them loudly, praising the Duke's presence and expressing his delight at seeing Thomas Hawthorne's daughter return to society. The sheer weight of Lord Hartley's approval forced a fracture in the wall of hostility. A few of the older families, those who remembered Arabella's father fondly, offered tentative nods. The tension shifted from absolute rejection to a wary standoff. Mateo wasted no time. He led Arabella to the center of the floor as the music resumed, a waltz that seemed deceptively light-hearted against the gravity of the moment. To dance with her was a breach of protocol. They were not engaged, and her reputation was in tatters, but the Duke moved with an arrogance that dared anyone to object. As they spun, the whispers began to rise, a susurrus of gossip that rippled through the room. It was then that Lady Prudence made her move. She had been holding court near the terrace doors, flanked by a miserable-looking Cordelia and a circle of sycophants. The sight of Arabella, resplendent in gold and ivory, dancing in the arms of the man she had intended for her own daughter, snapped the last of Prudence's restraint. She believed she held the ultimate weapon, the newspaper. Article, the public proof of Arabella's deceit. She did not wait for the dance to end. She moved into the center of the room, her purple gown cutting a violent swathe through the dancers, forcing the music to a discordant halt for the second time that night. The confrontation was not whispered in a corner, it was a public execution. Lady Prudence raised her voice so that it carried to the gallery above. She accused the Duke of being a fool, a foreigner, hoodwinked by a scheming impostor. She pointed a trembling finger at Arabella, labeling her a disgrace, a woman who had impersonated her betters to steal a title. She recited the narrative she had sold to the papers, that Arabella had used the storm and the darkness to trick the Duke into compromising her, trapping him in a web of lies. The room held its breath. This was the moment of ruin. By all the rules of their world, Arabella should have crumbled. She should have fled in tears, confirming her guilt. But Arabella did not move, and Mateo did not flinch. The Duke released Arabella, and from his hold, but stayed at her side, placing a protective hand on the small of her back. He waited for Prudence to finish her tirade, letting her venom spill out until the sheer ugliness of it hung in the air. When he spoke, his voice was not raised, but it possessed a timbre that commanded absolute silence. He addressed the room, not Prudence. He acknowledged the deception of the first night. He admitted that yes, for one evening he had believed Arabella was his intended bride. A gasp went through the crowd, an admission of guilt. Prudence smirked, sensing victory. But then Mateo pivoted. He explained why the deception had occurred. He stripped away the veneer of the Hawthorne estate to reveal the rot underneath. He spoke of the exile to the cottage, the financial strangulation, the erasure of a daughter from her own family history. He painted a picture not of a scheming seductress, but of a woman pushed to the brink of existence, who had hesitated to correct a mistake because, for the first time in 6 years, she was being treated with human dignity. He turned to Lady Prudence, his eyes cold and hard. He dismantled her narrative of the victim. He revealed that he had returned the very next morning, fully aware of the truth, and had made his choice then. He had not been trapped. He had been liberated. He declared that he had rejected Cordelia not because of Arabella's trickery, but because he had found a woman of superior intellect and spirit in the dower house, a woman whose character had survived the cruelty of her stepmother intact. Prudence tried to interrupt, to scream about the contract, but Mateo silenced her with a raised hand. He turned back to Arabella, ignoring the hundreds of watching eyes, creating a private sanctuary in the middle of the public floor. He reached into his pocket and produced a ring, not a simple band, but a heavy heirloom of the San Ronaldo family, bearing a crest set in onyx and gold. He did not ask her to dance. He asked her to reign. There, under the blaze of the chandeliers and the scrutiny of her enemies, the Duke of San Ronaldo dropped to one knee. He proposed. It was a masterstroke of strategy. By proposing in front of the entire county, he legitimized her instantly. He destroyed the mistress narrative. A man does not propose to a woman he intends to keep in the shadows. He offers her his name, his title, and his protection in the light. He asked Arabella to be his duchess, to leave the country that had scorned her and build a new life in a place where she would be celebrated. Arabella looked down at him, the tears finally spilling over, not from shame, but from relief. She said yes. Her voice was quiet, but in the hush of the ballroom it was heard by everyone. The aftermath was a cascade of shifting allegiances. Lord Hartley began the applause, a slow, rhythmic clapping that was soon taken up by the guests. It was not necessarily that they loved Arabella, but they loved a winner, and the Duke had just won. The tide turned violently against Lady Prudence. She stood isolated in the center of the floor, the crowd physically pulling away from her as if her malice were contagious. Cordelia, watching from the sidelines, did not rush to comfort her mother. For the first time, she stood still, a faint smile touching her lips, watching the sister she had been forced to abandon finally ascend. The rest of the evening blurred into a surreal procession of congratulations. People who had cut Arabella hours ago now pressed forward to admire the ring, their hypocrisy thinly veiled by politeness. Mateo navigated it all with a cool detachment, his focus entirely on Arabella. He had not just saved her reputation, he had rewritten her reality. As the ball drew to a close and the guests began to file out, casting backward glances at the couple who had conquered the season, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted permanently. The scandal had not destroyed them, it had crowned them. But as they walked out into the winter night, leaving a devastated Lady Prudence in their wake, the Duke knew that while the battle was won, the final departure from England would be the only way to secure the peace. The victory at the ball was sweet, but it was merely the prelude to a departure that would leave the Hawthorne legacy in ruins behind them. The proposal at Lord Hartley's ball was not merely a romantic gesture. It was a tactical nuclear strike against the social order of Yorkshire. In the days following the event, the county was in a state of upheaval. Lady Prudence, having been publicly dismantled by the Duke and shunned by Lord Hartley, retreated behind the heavy iron gates of Hawthorne Manor. The invitations that usually flooded the house during the winter season ceased abruptly. The servants whispered that the mistress walked the halls at night, pacing furiously, unable to comprehend how a girl she had erased for 6 years had managed to eclipse her own daughter in a single evening. For Arabella and Mateo, there was no time to bask in the victory. They understood that the adrenaline of the ball would soon fade, replaced by the inevitable scrutiny of a scandalized society. They chose speed over pageantry. 3 days after the ball, a small private ceremony was held in the village church. It was attended only by Lord Hartley, Mrs. Marsh, and, in a final act of quiet rebellion, Cordelia, who slipped away from the manor before dawn to witness her sister's union. There were no crowds, no elaborate breakfasts, just the solemn exchange of vows that bound the outcast daughter to one of the wealthiest men in Europe. By noon, the carriage was packed. Arabella did not look back at Rosewood Cottage, nor at the imposing shadow of the manor on the hill. She left England with nothing but the clothes on her back, her husband's hand in hers, and the liberation of a woman who has survived the fire. The journey to Italy was long, a physical shedding of the cold grey skin of her past. As they crossed the Alps and descended into the sun-drenched valleys of the south, the claustrophobia of her exile began to lift. The arrival in San Ronaldo was a revelation. Arabella had expected another imposing stone fortress, perhaps warmer, but equally rigid. Instead, the Palazzo de Severini was a place of light and air, surrounded by lemon groves and vineyards that stretched to the sea. The people of the duchy did not care about the rumours of English drawing rooms. They saw only that their duke had returned with a bride who looked at him with genuine devotion. Mateo's sister, Caterina, a formidable woman who managed the estate's finances, embraced Arabella not as a stranger, but as the saviours of her brother's happiness. For the first time in her life, Arabella was not too much or not enough. She was simply her grace. She threw herself into the management of the estate, applying the keen intellect that Prudence had. Despised to the flourishing of the duchy, she learned Italian faster than she had learned the peerage, and within a year the English duchess was as beloved in the market squares of San Ronaldo as she had been reviled in the tea shops of Yorkshire. 2 years passed. The sharp edges of the trauma began to soften, replaced by the rhythms of a life lived in the sun. The silence of Rosewood Cottage was a distant memory. replaced by the laughter of a son, Alessandro, who had inherited his father's dark eyes and his mother's fighting spirit. Yet, a part of Arabella remained tethered to the misty hills of her childhood, waiting for the final echo of the storm. It arrived in the form of a letter, carried by a courier from England. The handwriting was familiar, though stronger and more confident than Arabella remembered. It was from Cordelia. Arabella sat in the garden, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air, and broke the seal. The contents were a testament to the ripple effect of courage. Cordelia wrote that the atmosphere at Hawthorne Manor had disintegrated after the wedding. Lady Prudence, unable to bear the social isolation imposed by Lord Hartley's edict, had attempted to force Cordelia into another match, this time with an aging baron known for his cruelty, but possessed of a fortune large enough to perhaps buy their way back into society. But the Cordelia who wrote the letter was not the terrified girl of 2 years ago. Arabella's defiance had planted a seed. Cordelia refused the match. When Prudence threatened to disown her, Cordelia simply left. She had sought sanctuary with Lord Hartley, who had delighted in shielding the second sister as he had the first. The most shocking news, however, was of Prudence herself. The letter detailed a swift and brutal decline, stripped of her social standing, ignored by her neighbours, and abandoned by the daughter she had tried to mould into a puppet. Lady Prudence had surrendered. She had sold the London townhouse to cover debts incurred in her desperate attempts to maintain appearances, and had retreated to a small, unfashionable house in Bath, where she lived in bitterness and obscurity, complaining to anyone who would listen about the ungrateful vipers she had raised. The woman who had ruled Arabella's life with terror was now nothing more than a ghost story. Cordelia ended the letter with her own news. She had not married a duke nor a baron. She had married a landscape painter she met in Lord Hartley's gardens, a man with no title, modest means, and a kind heart. They lived in a cottage in the Lake District, not unlike Rosewood, but filled with light and easels. She signed the letter not as a victim, but as a sister and an equal. Mateo found Arabella crying softly in the garden, the letter clutched in her hand. He feared bad news, but when she looked up, her smile was radiant. She handed him the pages, and as he read, he understood. The circle was closed. The toxicity that had poisoned the hawthorn roots had been purged. That evening, standing on the balcony overlooking the shimmering Mediterranean, Mateo asked Arabella the question that had haunted him since that first rainy night. He asked if she ever regretted the deception, the moment she hesitated at the door, the moment she let him believe a lie so she could feel loved. Arabella looked at the life they had built. The thriving estate, the sleeping child, the letter from a free sister. She realized that the mistake of the storm had not been an error at all. It was the universe correcting a wrong. The storm had forced a man of honor to stop at the wrong door so he could find the right woman. It had stripped away the artifice of titles and contracts to reveal the raw truth of character. She took his hand, the ring he had placed there in the ballroom catching the last light of the sun. She told him that she regretted nothing. The storm, the mud, the cold, the fear, it was the price of admission to this life. The wrong door had led to the only destination that mattered. The story of the Duke and his accidental bride became a legend in both Yorkshire and San Ronaldo, whispered by romantics and cited by rebels. It stood as a reminder that destiny is rarely neat and justice is rarely swift, but for those with the courage to endure the rain, the sun eventually breaks through. Arabella Hawthorne had been erased, exiled, and silenced, but she had refused to disappear. In the end, she didn't just survive the storm, she became the architect of the clear sky that followed, and in the quiet of the Italian twilight the past was finally truly at rest.